One of my primary research interests is thinking about the place of secular aesthetics in contemporary Pakistan. And I think about how there are various forms which are not just textual but are also visual and often even, of course, poetic, that tend to resist nationalisms, religious fundamentalisms in a much more subtle manner than we think of, ostensibly at least. The term secular, of course, many of us associate with non-religious, perhaps. Many of us think that to be secular is to not have any religious association. But I come to the word secular through the work of Edward Said, who's best known, of course, for his groundbreaking work, which was Orientalism. But his essay on secular criticism actually tells us something else about the term. And one of the things Said says about being secular is that the term suggests some kind of opposition, perhaps, to what we can think of as rigidity or as a certain kind of ossification of thought and ideas. He points, of course, most significantly to the problem of nationalism, to the problems of religious fundamentalism, and then the idea, of course, extends further into questions of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, minoritization, and of course that becomes very relevant in contemporary Pakistan today. One of the major works that I think is very important in this long trajectory of secular aesthetics in Pakistan is Intezar Husain's Basti. I also teach Basti in several of my courses, one of which is titled The Secular Position, the other which is titled Exile. But following from Intezar Husain's work, I think about what's happening in Pakistan today and what is the secular space, what kind of a space do people, artists, thinkers, intellectuals have to speak about secularism today. And one of the things I look at is visual media. YouTube videos, perhaps to call them YouTube videos is perhaps a little erroneous, but pop videos in particular, independent bands such as Beghairat Brigade, these are all art forms that we need to think about more seriously than we do. For example, these are forms that critique institutions of the state, that ask everybody, every single person perhaps, and these are very accessible forms. That's something we need to remember. For example, a work such as Alu Ande will ask us to think about religious fundamentalism in a more critical fashion than we are already, and will ask us to come to this from really the ordinary person's point of view rather than a more theoretical or obscure language than is usually used. So what I like to look at is how these forms exist in a space that is interestingly minoritized itself, and yet of course manages to address issues of class, issues of religion, often issues of gender inequality as well, which is something that is not happening, I think, in popular media at least. And one of the other things I do is think about these forms in opposition to what we can think of as works that are more nationalist, perhaps, works that are more mainstream and that propagate what we can think of as the state's project. One of these forms, of course, is the Urdu drama, is the Urdu serial play, and that is something that has been furthering the state project for almost several decades now in Pakistan. The most important example these days, of course, remains Humsafar, where the figure of the woman is domesticized to an extent that she cannot exist without a male partner, really, where she becomes a sign of piety, of religious practice, of chastity, while the male, of course, is somebody who interestingly also has to be reformed through this pious woman. So there's a new construction of the family altogether that is reflective of a certain national mood today as well. And just to kind of link this to a much longer practice in Pakistan, I want to just kind of add that these forms and these ideas are not are not new. They are perhaps emerging from what we know as the Muslim reformist movement of the late 1800s, where certain ideas of how women need to be wives, dutiful wives who are the moral compasses of their husbands, emerge right there and then. And of course, the most famous of these works is Dipti Nazir Ahmed's Miratul Arus. And so gender requires a whole other kind of perspective in these works, and that perspective is what extends into our current moment today. Now, so these are the two things I look at very closely. One, of course, is a kind of what we can think of as a nationalist view that begins, of course, in colonial India and extends and expands in contemporary Pakistan. And the other, of course, is resistance to this kind of ideology, which, as I said, comes out in the more peripheral works of Manto, of Intizar Hussain, and then now more recently in perhaps even in film, in independent films such as Bol perhaps, or Zinda Bhag, of course, becomes a very important example in all of this. Works that are resisting the state as a place of stability, works that are resisting the state as a space that is necessarily providing a sense of identity, works that are actually bringing to the forefront issues of what it means to be marginalized, what it means to be minoritized, what it means to not have a place in the national narrative.